the cloud. Turn this off. Okay. So I'm going to share my screen again. There we go. So these are the resources that we have for the two things we have to do, the writing systems and the sounds of Old English. There's the chapter, and then if you're at the website under texts, you'll see that there's a whole bunch of resources that I have there that cover different things. The Old English alphabet pronunciation, a new one, a crash course on translating that shows you some techniques you can use, a broader sort of short discussion of how to study Old English. On that one, actually, when you click through, you go to a redirect, and then there's the basic Old English grammar, which we'll talk more about in a couple of weeks, actually probably next week. I should say that these are not always, these have been prepared over many years, and so they don't always line up 100% with what is going on in this particular textbook, which is a new one for this course for me. But on the whole, you'll find that they agree because it's a first year course and stuff is pretty similar. So today we're going to talk about the Old English alphabet first, and it kind of raises an interesting theoretical problem almost right away, the way it's presented also in your chapter. And that is that we're talking about a writing system and we're talking about sounds, and the question is, well, how do they relate to each other? So in the Old English period, there were really two writing systems in use. There was one based on the Roman alphabet, which is by far the most common. And then there was another one that was used occasionally, a runic one, but it is really not used except in very sort of occasional circumstances. And I've got you two images here to show you the two different writing systems. The one on the left, the manuscript, is from the B1 copy of the Old English Historia Ecclesiastica. It's actually got Cadman's hymn in the middle there. If you, about 5 lines down where the what we would call a capital N is the beginning of Cadman's hymn. And that's written in an insular script. This scribe is kind of an interesting scribe, but he's got a beautiful sort of classic insular hand, which is why I've got it there. And the one on the right is actually a 3D model of the Ruthwell Cross, which is from a project that I'm working on. And you can see the runes. They're unfortunately, the contrast isn't super great, but you can see the runes sort of along the vine scroll there. And that's a copy of what we think of as the Dream of the Rood, copied out in runes on the Ruthwell Cross. But we're going to be doing we're going to be learning the one on the other side. And most of our symbols are graphemically similar to ours. And I'm using the word graphemically here quite consciously. For those of you who've got any social science background, you should probably know the difference between emic and etic. Emic is the systemic understanding of something, and etic is the understanding of individual instances. Actually comes from linguistics, where you talk about phonemic and phonetic. And so a phonemic difference is a kind of fundamental difference in the mental understanding that speakers have of their language. It's a systemic thing. So for example, we all have slightly different ways of pronouncing letters, but all of us who are native English speakers in Canada have basically, we all recognize that B and P, the thing we write as B and the thing we write as P are different from each other, that I can use those two to distinguish between different words. You know, if I have a slightly nasal accent, I might say my B's a bit differently from you. If I've got a cold, I might say them differently. So B versus P is a phonemic, it's a systemic difference. And having a cold when you say B or sh or th or something creates phonetic differences. Well, you can apply that also to writing. And so Old English is graphemically similar to us. That is to say, their writing system has most of our, the system of characters roughly matches ours, but at the etic level, it looks quite different. So if you look at that manuscript there, for example, one etic difference right away is that first word on the top left is S-I-N-G-A-N. And that S, the very first character on the page, is not how we write S's. It looks like RR, maybe. So that is graphemically, that is an S. That is to say, in their system, they have a character which they use to indicate S, where we use our S. But it's graphetically different because they use that kind, what we would think of maybe as a long S. They actually have two etic S's. They have an S that looks like ours as well. There's probably one on this page. So they have, in terms of their system, they have a character for every one of our characters, pretty much. The two they don't have is, they don't have a V as a separate character, and they don't have a J as a separate character. And they actually do write V's and J's, but they don't understand there to be a distinction between U and V and I and J. That is to say, V and U are alternates for each other, and I and J are alternates for each other. And you can see these, you might see the word up spelled vup with a V instead of a U. You'll sometimes see this, the Romans did the same thing. You'll sometimes see it in Roman inscriptions, a V rather than what we think of as a U. And the J is used basically as a long kind of I. The writing system they use is based on something called minims, which is basically just little strokes, constantly small little strokes, like the body of an I without its dot. And then they make an N, for example, by putting two minims really close to each other. If you look at this guy actually draws his lines a little bit more carefully, but if you look at that first word again, you've got the long S, and then you've got an I. They don't dot their I's. And then you've got basically the exact same stroke as the left-hand stroke of the N. And then this guy is drawing what we would think of an N, but quite commonly, they'll just do another I right beside it, a little bit closer. And then you got to take the two of them as if they're an N. And those are called minims. Well, you can imagine that gets quite confusing. So they often use the J, the thing that's like our J, to break up sequences of I's. So for example, when they do the Roman numeral 4, they don't do IV the way we would. They do 4 I's, except the last one will be a J to indicate that the number's finished. So J and I are basically equivalent to each other. They're graphemically the same. They're graphetically different. And later on, they become graphemes in our system. They do use K, Q, and Z, mostly in foreign words. And as the period goes on, you start seeing, especially in the very late Old English period, you start seeing K show up instead of C in where we would say K. And then they have 3 additional symbols, which I pointed to last time, ash, thorn, and eth. And I should say, by the way, things in pointed brackets are graphemes. We use pointed brackets to indicate I'm talking about the system of spelling, not how they look in the manuscript. Fortunately, the consonants, so the letters that indicate the consonant sounds, are actually not super hard in Old English. The ones in the left column, the B, the D, the L, the M, the N, the P, and the R character, represent the sounds that they would in modern English, more or less. So you have Yabidina, Die, Landa, Mid, Nim, Ship, and Richt, probably a ruled R. This is where this gets a bit theoretically odd here. I've got pointed brackets, so I'm talking about the grapheme, but I'm also talking about the sound, the phoneme that they actually say. I haven't written those in there, but I was saying them. So the grapheme B is used for the phoneme B. The grapheme D is used for the phoneme D, just more or less what we would do. The next set are interesting. Once again, the pointed brackets mean grapheme. The square brackets mean phonetic sound. So I'm not talking about a phoneme, a systematic sound in Old English. I'm talking about what's known as allophones. And this is maybe a little bit complicated. I won't go into the linguistics of it too much here, but basically in modern English, the letter S or the sound S and the sound Z are phonemically different from each other. That is to say, we can think of words that are distinguished only by whether or not it's a f or a v sound. An easy one is at the bottom, just because it came up in the graduate course this morning. The thorn and the F are used for the sounds that we spell with TH, and that is two different sounds. In modern English, they're phonemic. The one sound, the one that's looks like a circle with the bar through it, is a voiceless sound. And so the first letter in fat is said fat, like our word thigh, upper part of your leg. And the second word there's quaff, again with that sound from like our word thigh. And the bottom one is said th. So that word is quathon. And that sound is like our word thy, the old-fashioned way of saying, you know, you're. And if you think about it for a second, thigh and thy, the only difference between those two is on the thing we spell TH. And the only difference between them is if you hold your finger on your pulse points and you say thy, you'll feel a trill in your throat. And if you say thigh, you won't hear that same trill until you get to the I part. It doesn't trill in your throat. That trilling is known as voicing, and that's actually what's going on with all three of those characters. So in the bottom one, the thorn and the F, you've got voiceless, fat, and quath, and you've got voiced, quathon. And the only distinction, these are not phonemic in Old English, it's entirely conditioned by position. And the difference is at the beginning or end of a word, it's voiceless. And in the middle between vowels, for example, or beside other voiced sounds, it's voiced. So we've got quaff at the end, and then quathon, the infinitive form. It's the same word, it's a different form though, because the symbol is appearing between the E and the A. It's got a voiced because vowels are voiced. Quathon, or quathon, sorry. And then the same is true of the S and the F. So S, if it's found at the beginning of a word or at the end of a word or in the context of other consonants that don't have that trill, it's said like S. And if it's found in a context between vowels or beside a D or a B, which you wouldn't find that latter one, I don't think, it would be a Z sound. So wheeze, right? So you've got say, seolas, west, or wheeze. The Toronto Maple Leafs are actually, as I was saying in my other class, is kind of a great Old English example of this, because should be the Toronto Maple Leaves for us, but F and S are both non-voiced. So an Anglo-Saxon, if he was going to be watching the game, would be perfectly happy calling them the Leafs. Now, actually, he'd call them the Leovas because the plural's got a vowel there, but nevertheless, he wouldn't have a problem with the name. Same's true with F, fondion and weef. Sound comes at the beginning or the end, it's f. And if it comes in the middle, weaves, then it's a V sound. And that is, by the way, the origin, in fact, of that F-V difference in why words that end in F have plurals in V. It's because of that. The plural of all of these has two vowels. So weef, their word for what becomes our word wife, the plural, wives, is because of this change from weef to weaves. And then the third column is sort of the same thing. The letters can stand for different, originally probably phonetic, later phonemic distinctions in the language. And again, I'll start at the bottom. The letter for G can be used for what we think of as a hard G, God, goad, yard, or what we think of as a soft G, yard. A lot of those soft G's we now spell, the descendant word we spell with a Y. So you can guess, yard, modern English word is yard. It doesn't mean exactly the same thing, but it's the same word. Goad is the God word. Going up one, we've got the C, the letter C. It can be either what we think of as a hard K, a hard sound, or a soft sound, either K or Ch. That Ch sound, by the way, is incredibly characteristic of English and Frisian. They both share that sound. We in our textbook write both the soft G and the soft C with a dot above it to indicate that's the Ch or the Y sound, but they don't do that in the manuscripts. And Murray's got a rule in his text about it that's probably okay. It's a little bit more complicated than he says. Probably you're safest saying that if the C is coming before whatever's a back vowel, and I'll explain what those are, but U or O basically, it's probably a K sound. It's a little bit harder to say what happens if it comes in front of a front vowel, so an I, an E, maybe even an ash, because there's some rules intervene. But as a rule anyway, it's Kuman, Kuning versus Shield. And then H is probably the most complicated one. It has three different sounds. Initially, it's like the H in house, hoose. And then it has two different sounds. It can either be like the sh in ich, a sort of unvoiced sh sound, like German, or, and Murray says lach, but I think lach is unvoiced. I think this is a voice sound. Anyway, a tach, it's a kind of backer, that same sort of thing. He says like loch, so it's sh or ch. And that's when it happens either inside the, medially in the word or at the end of the word. This is a ton of information. We're getting it out there now. It's in the textbook, and we're going to practice it over and over and over again. It's just so you get an orientation now. And then the last two things on this is SC together is sh, like in ship, and CG together are like what we would spell DGE, like edge. That's the word for edge there. Some books, I don't remember if Murray's does or not, put a dot above the C in ship, if it's that way, because there are a few cases in Old English where it's actually a sk sound, usually in words that have been borrowed from Danish or you know, any of the Northern Germanic languages, and there's a few of them. Any questions actually about the consonants before I go on? Either throw a hand up or put something in the chat. Okay, not hearing any, I'll move on. So we're looking at the vowels now, and I've had to do it differently for the vowels because the vowels are actually not massively different, but there's a couple of things that are intervening. Let me explain this diagram here first, and again, we're throwing a lot at you. We will repeat it, but basically that trapezoid, you notice I haven't arranged the vowels the way you'd imagine I would, A, E, I, O, U, in alphabetical order. And the reason why I haven't is that's not actually a very handy way of understanding vowels. The better way of understanding vowels linguistically is by where they're said in your mouth. And so that trapezoid is the inside of your mouth. Your nose is to the left and the back of your throat is to the right. And basically what it's showing you is where the highest point of your tongue is when you say each of these sounds. So when we say the word beat, these are modern English words, by the way, in single quotation marks. When I say the word beat, the highest part of my tongue is as far front and as high as it's going to be. When I say the word boot, the highest point of my tongue, it's a different part of my tongue, is as hard is at the farthest back and the highest it possibly could be. So we call E a high front vowel, and we call oo a high back vowel. And so we talk about vowels in terms of height and frontness or backness. So basically the way to see this, and these have real linguistic impact. If you remember on the previous one, I said things are, C is a K sound when it's in front of a back vowel. Well, that means either a U, an O, or an A, or actually the EO or EA together thing. So that's back vowel, meaning the back half of your mouth as you say it. And I said that it's harder to say, but it's often ch in front of a front vowel. I mean I, E, or ash, because those are said in the front of your mouth.
No kidding.
Questions? Did I hear? No? Okay. So I'm just going to run around the sounds first, and then we'll talk about the letters. So this is the vowels in Old English, and they have a long and short system. So this is actually interesting. There are different traditions amongst scholars of early medieval English as to how we say these. In the Anglophone world, we do two different things. Well, actually, sorry, let me say what the difference is between modern English and Old English. In modern English, we don't have length. Even though we call some vowels long vowels and other vowels short vowels, that's not actually true. When the difference between the E in beat, which is a long vowel in our system, and the I in bit is not length of the time that you say it, it's qualitatively different. My tongue is actually at a slightly different place. And more importantly, when I say the long vowels, I tense my chest muscles. So those are tense vowels. And the I relax it. I don't have to be as tense when I say that. So E, I tense sort of over my chest. I'm lax. We don't have any length difference between those. Same's true the next one down. A in bait is a tense vowel. Bet is a lax vowel in modern English. They're qualitatively different from each other. It's not quantitatively different. That is to say, it doesn't take longer to say. Bat, we don't have a tense and a lax version of that. Oo, tense. Lax. O, tense. Lax. And is just difficult for Canadians to say, period. In Old English, in theory, and we know this from their poetry and other things, they have a quantitative distinction. That is to say, the difference between the two vowels is not that it's stressed, tense, or lax, but it takes longer. So you would imagine then that the difference between beat and bit and beat, that you wouldn't actually have a qualitative difference. It would be the same sound, just longer or shorter. And that actually happens in a lot of languages where it's the same sound, it's just longer or shorter. However, because this is a dead language and we get to make up the rules, in different traditions, we have different ways of saying it. In the Anglophone tradition, we treat them as both quantitatively and qualitatively different. So what we do is we say beat and bit. What I'm really doing is a stressed, a tense long vowel and a short lax vowel. But who knows? Maybe it wasn't. Maybe it was beat and beat. Maybe it really was just length. And there are other traditions amongst early medieval scholars where they just do that. So the letter I is used, we think, for the sounds in E and I. The Y I'll come back to in a second. The letter E, the letter we write, we call E, is used for the sound A, as in bait, and E, as in bet. So bait, bet. I'm trying to get long, short, and also tense lax. The ash, the A and the E together, is used for bat and bet, short and long versions of the same sound. The A character is used for the sound as in father, both long and short. So father and father. The reason I have to use father there is I can't think of a BT frame that can have that sound. It's also the same as American aunt. Most Canadians say aunt rather than aunt. Most Americans say aunt. And British people say aunt as well. So that father sound is that aunt sound. It's actually really hard for Canadians to get. We have the way these things work is these are phonemic differences. So they're in your mental picture of your language. And Canadians, the sound we're very intolerant there. We only accept there's a very narrow margin that if you go outside of it, it sounds to us like aw, one higher, or one farther forward. That's why we say aunt, moving it to sound rather than aunt. because we're farther enough forward that we hear it belongs to the next one. Anyway, this is a really hard sound for Canadians. The letter O is used for both the boat sound and the bot sound. And the letter U finally is used for both the boot sound and the book sound. Whoops, sorry. Yes, so M's question is absolutely. There are words in Old English that distinguish entirely by the length of the vowel. That's it. In fact, I can give you one right away. God and goad. Our word for God and our word for good in Old English are distinguished entirely by the length of the O. God, short, is the deity, and goad, long, is the quality. Oh yes, and that's good. Rachel's got another good one too. I'd never thought of that before. Man and evil and God and good are pairs. And then finally, we've got the diphthongs in the middle, and Old English has falling diphthongs. That means diphthongs can be rising or falling, and it means that we put the stress on the first half. The way a diphthong works is it's also known as a glide. When you say a diphthong, the first part is where your tongue starts, and the second part is where your tongue ends. So if you look at that IE one, I've written in slanted brackets, that's phonemic notation, that it was probably said ia. That means it moved from the top left, and the schwa is roughly in the middle. It moved from top left to middle, your tongue as you say it. The bottom one, EA, was probably said ah, where my tongue is moving from the bottom left, ah, sort of up towards the middle where schwa would be. But Old English is falling diphthongs, and that means they put a huge emphasis on where your tongue starts and very little on where it ends. So Murray's recommendation of just say the first part is actually a very good recommendation. We have lots of evidence that that's the case. There's one thing to notice here, and that is I don't have the word, for instance, bite, which is what we think of as the long I, and I don't have the word, I don't have a word like house. I can't think of a B word right now. I could actually have the word hoose, Old English, on this chart, but I can't use it as a model, and that's because of something called the Great Vowel Shift. And you might notice a problem as I'm saying these words. Blouse, yeah, blouse, yeah, that would do it. And the issue is, notice that I called the one that's got the words bait and bet beside it, I called it the letter E, but I said the word, it says got the sound A. And up one higher, I said, oh yeah, there you've got the letter I, and it makes the sound E. And you may notice a correspondence here, that when I say I say the sound for the letter that's the name of the letter below. And if you know any European languages other than English, you'll know that the names of the letters are like out by one. In Dutch, the letter that we call E, they call A. And the letter that we call I, they call E. And why is that? Well, that's because of something that happens after the Old English period. We'll talk more about it later because it's a little bit complicated. But basically, between Chaucer and Shakespeare, all of the long vowels moved one up. So as a rule, we'll talk more about it, but as a rule, if you hear an E in Old English, it's almost certainly an I in modern English. If you hear a oo in Old English, like in hoose, it's going to be an ow in modern English. So hoose, house. And that's a pretty strong correspondence. It happens to the long vowels, not the short vowels. Great. That's it for now. Again, we're throwing a lot of information at you, but we'll keep returning to it in practice. So I wanted to pick up one last thing that Murray talks about in his chapter, and that has to do with how solid our knowledge is of this. And I'm more comfortable with what we know about it than he is, I think. If the test is what he mentions in his chapter, that you ran into an Anglo-Saxon, would you be able to converse with them? The answer is probably no. But on the other hand, that's not surprising because we're talking about an 800-year period and 5 dialects. And, you know, the language changes over time. If you ever get a chance to listen to Canadian reporters, for example, from World War II versus the 70s versus now, radio reporters sound differently over those times. A really neat example is the Haltons. So David Halton's now retired political reporter of the 80s and 90s and early aughts. His father was a reporter for the CBC during World War II. And you can really hear the difference in the accent over time, let alone the 19th century, let alone the time of Shakespeare. And remember, Shakespeare is within the early Mid-English period. If we just moved everything, the length of time would include the time between us and Shakespeare. So it's not surprising to me that, you know, if you think about Scottish, the difference between Scottish and Louisianan and Toronto is pretty big, but they all use the same phonemic system. So if we were on the street in medieval London, early medieval London, I'm not sure they'd understand us. But I am pretty confident that we know what their set of phonemes were. We may not know how they phonetically said it, each one, so that's why we don't sound perfect. But I believe we're pretty confident about what the distribution of these things was. And the reason is because, well, I'll show you on the next slide, but because of how we developed this difference. But to give you an example of even language changing right now, this is one, we should have done a test on this. So language change is really interesting because it often happens with women first. And something that my wife's been noticing recently in Canada is the way that women basically Gen X are a little bit younger than Gen X are saying words like flexible. And so if you listen to, I can't remember which of the cabinet ministers does it, but one of the women cabinet ministers says flexible, and Justin Trudeau says flexible. And I've been listening since my wife pointed this out, and I'm hearing more women say flexible, that kind of sound, rather than flexible. So you can hear there's a difference of how stuff rises or falls, like it moves a little bit. So I don't think we've gotten down to that degree, but we have it in broad terms. So I'm pretty sure that they had an sound as opposed to an sound, right? So how do we know it? Well, first thing to keep in mind is actually the other reason why an Anglo-Saxon on the street wouldn't understand us is because we probably would sound very old-fashioned to them, because we have a lot of evidence that their writing does not entirely reflect what they said, a little bit like the way ours doesn't. For example, we're pretty sure that certainly by the end of the period, they weren't saying the full value of their vowels and their endings. So stan, the word for stone, is plural is stanas, but almost certain they were saying stanas. But they wrote out stanas still. And so since we're watching what they wrote, we would sound a little bit weird. It would be kind of like if somebody came now and then read something about Monty Python and the Knicks of the Holy Grail. If they didn't know that we don't say the K anymore, or that the H is gone, if they just tried to sound it out, they'd probably sound a bit funny to us, because their writing system is also more archaic than what they're speaking. But on the whole, I think they probably recognized that we were speaking their language really badly. And the reason why we know this is a couple of fold. One is it's written in the Roman alphabet. They had to believe that an S was an S, sort of. I mean, you wouldn't like, oh, I think I should borrow this alphabet, but everywhere where the Roman, I mean, I've got a cunning plan, Wealthiel. Rather than move the street signs around, you know, sort of like England during the war, right, where they changed the street signs around so when the Germans invade, they don't know where London is. So the Anglo-Saxons are sitting there thinking, you know what? What if we make like every S, that'll be a K, and every K, that'll be a P. And then when they invade from Europe, they'll never know what we say. Sort of an early linguistic Brexit or something. We know that since they're using the Roman alphabet, there must have been something close to a correspondence at some point in the history. It's also the ancestor of modern English. So the fact that we say child is almost certainly not unrelated to how they said it. I'd be really surprised if they said swizzle and spelt it C-I-L-D. So our words can also help us with that. And more importantly, we can track the changes as they go. So we can watch how the language changes over time. And we've got multiple points where people are writing the same word down as it changes over time, and we can watch that spelling change. This is especially good with loan words because loan words keep entering the language at different times. And so we can watch it. The word moneta, I've used a few times now, has come in a word meaning like coin or money. It comes in several times in the English language, and we can watch it. And then once it enters, we can watch the changes happen to it. So our word mint comes from that word, and it's the German word Mund, except in English, all of those U's underwent a process known as I umlaut or fronting. In certain contexts, they became front vowels, and you can see that. That means it must have been an U earlier on when it came in. And finally, meter, rhyme, and alliteration tell us a lot about pronunciation. We know, for example, just to go back a little bit, an interesting question in the history of English is that C and that G, because they use the letter C for K and Ch, and they use the letter G for G and Y. In the poetry then, does Ch and K alliterate, or does G and Y alliterate? And the answer is later on, more or less, mostly not. Earlier on, sometimes well. This can be used as a sort of dating thing, but the fact that they stop alliterating, or at least you can see them not alliterating, tells you have a sense of the changes coming in the language. So you can use alliteration, meter, those kind of things. That's, for instance, how we know the long short works, because sometimes the only difference in a poetic line is the length of the vowel. And I think the main point to keep in mind is our knowledge of Old English spelling is not a single point in time snapshot. If we had a single manuscript, we wouldn't maybe be able to do this. But because we have a series of manuscripts and English is part of a continuum of a language that interacts with other languages also over time, we can do a fair bit of comparative work to piecing it all together. Oh, and I guess the last one I forgot to say. The other thing that's really cool is the scribes are actually very well trained. I always say, compared to Middle English scribes, they're a complete disaster. And, honestly, I think we would have been better off if nobody taught them how to write. But the Old English scribes, those people were trained. And so they're usually pretty careful. But occasionally they make a mistake the same way you might, writing down the wrong version of there or the wrong, our or R if you're taking notes real fast. And when that happens, we get to see their underlying dialect or, what they're really saying. So for instance, at the end of the period, it's pretty clear they're not making any distinction between the sounds represented by I, Y, or IE, because my dissertation was every single scribal variant in Old English poetry. And by far the most common variation is I, Y, and IE interchangeably. Even IG shows up interchangeably, which tells you they're not hearing any difference between those. Great. Any questions? I want to just do a quick thing for translation, but if there's any questions, I can take them. I see Rachel's grabbing things and Dylan in the answers in the chat there. All right, not seeing anything. I'll go on for the tips for translation. So what we're going to do next class is break into our sections. To stop this Zoom room, breakout room business, you've been assigned a separate Zoom room now. I sent you all a calendar invite for that, but what I'll probably do is get Rachel and Dylan and me to send out invites to our guys again, telling you what room to come to on Wednesday. And we're going to just start with the translation, reading aloud, and then translating. It can be very hard in the beginning, so don't worry if it's really hard, and we'll take it real slow in the beginning. In the graduate class today, we did one sentence. So, it's going to go slow. I'd like you to remember we're doing two things. We're translating the meaning of the words, and we're translating the syntax of the sentence. And we've got to do both of those. So the first part's not that hard. You'll just look up the word in the glossary. And one thing we'll come back to over and over and over again is it's really tempting to think that the Old English word means what it means in modern English. That's not true. It doesn't mean it's Old English translation, it's modern English translation. It means König, the word that we translate as king, means König. It doesn't mean king. And then König has a variety of meanings and uses that you can do. Queen is another one. Wief is another one. Sure, it's our word wife, but it has a larger range of meanings. It's used differently. Weef doesn't mean wife, it means weef. But we try to find the one that means the closest to what it's supposed to mean in Old English. You're going to have to change. So an example, bouton means, this is just from Murray's gloss, means except, provided that, unless, or without. And which one of those you're going to have to decide. And it depends on context. You're going to have to choose. And then something to keep in mind is it's not always clear actually that it is going to work. And sometimes the glossaries are wrong. In fact, my second article was showing that a gloss that people were using was wrong. So the second part is a little bit more complex, just because we can look up what a word means in a dictionary, but you can't really look up a syntax construction in the dictionary. And also because Old English and present day English are quite different from each other, theoretically speaking. In practice, they're actually not, which causes trouble. So Old English word order is very close often to modern English word order, except when it isn't, which is when it causes trouble. But theoretically speaking, they don't understand the word order the same way we do. And so I like to explain this. These are not the scientific terms, as a flag language versus a slot language. And what I mean by that is, in Old English, they use the endings on the words to tell you what the thing is doing in the sentence. And they will pay attention to that over word order. It's a synthetic language. We're an analytic language. That is to say, we decide what a word means by where it is in a sentence. And I think I've already mentioned this, but the theoretical difference between us, even when the word order is exactly the same in the two languages, if there's a conflict between an ending and a position, in the early medieval scribes will privilege the ending over position, whereas we will, in almost all circumstances, privilege position over the ending. So I can give you an example. If I say me go to the store, you think one of three things. You think either that I'm speaking a dialect where that's allowed, maybe some kind of Creole-based language, sometimes get that in Caribbean maybe or something, or you'll think I made a mistake, but I meant I go to the store. If an Anglo-Saxon heard the same thing, they would think there's just a mistake. They wouldn't understand the sentence because there's nothing there that's a subject, and they've got an extra object. So the sentence doesn't make sense. And you might say, how could they be so stupid? So let me try one on you. My go to the store. You can't make that make sense because that's the one place where we privilege ending over word position. But for the Old English speakers, everything was like that. So me go to the store sounded just as off to them as my go to the store sounds to us. And that has implications then for the translation because we have to go from their language to ours. So I've given you a sentence here and whoops, and I'm cheating here because you'd never get a sentence like this in Old English in this word order. But you, in theory, could have a sentence that said the queen, her daughter, the sword, gave. You couldn't. This sentence would never exist in Old English. But in theory, you could have it because they use the inflections to tell you what the words mean. So what we have to do is we have to then look at those inflections and then put them in the right spots because we always do subject, verb, object, right? So what we've got to do is find out, okay, what goes in the subject slot? Well, we look for the nominative. So the queen, bam, the queen. And then the next one for us is the verb. We've got to go find a verb. So it's not her daughter, because that's dative. It's not the sword, because that's accusative. Oh, there it is, third singular preterite gave. So then we got to move it to the second spot. The queen gave. And then we've got to ask ourselves, what did she give and to whom? And I've done it this way, her daughter, the indirect object. So I got to go look for the dative. Dative is what they use for the indirect object. Put it in the second slot, first slot after the verb, her daughter. And then finally, I need to know what she gave her. And that's the accusative, is the direct object case. So I got to go find the accusative and then put it in the last spot. I could have translated this instead. The queen gave the sword to her daughter. That would have been fine too. But basically what I've got to do is take all the words, look for their endings, and then put them in the right order for modern English. And that's the big difference between the two. Sometimes though, the grammar just doesn't line up. So verbs of feasting and verbs of deprivation, as it says here, take genitive, well, we say they take genitive objects. That's just not true. They just don't take objects in Old English. What we would express as the object is done with a possessive, weirdly. So this is a very crash course. We're going to come and pick this up later, but basically this chart that you're seeing here is the equivalencies that you're going to be looking for. So you're going to look, when you're trying to find a sentence, you're going to read along, find the thing that's in the nominative, and that's going to be your subject. And you can test it using pronoun substitution. It would be the form that would be I, he, she, we, or they. Notice I'm not using all because that's not that handy. Accusative, that gets translated to where the object would go. And the object in English can be substituted for by me, him, us, or them. The genitive is mostly, well, not mostly, but it's used for possession. And that's the one we would translate using my, his, her, or their, or our. And then finally, the dative, I call it the by with to for case because it tends to be used wherever you would have a prepositional phrase or for indirect objects. And so it can be translated by, it would be a noun phrase that could be translated by with, to, for, me, or him, or her, or us, or them. And so basically that's the very first thing that you're doing. Okay? Yeah, the slides and the text are going to be posted right afterwards. So last point, what should you do in terms of target? Because you know, when you're translating, are you trying to be idiomatic? Are you trying to be literal? What are you trying to do? Remember, this is not a course in translation from Old English. This is a course in which we're using translation to learn to learn Old English. So a super idiomatic translation that doesn't show you understand the grammar beneath it is less useful for us than a slightly stilted one that still makes sense but shows your understanding the constructions. So as a rule, art is not what you should be aiming for here. The very best student I ever had was able to idiomatically reflect the Old English pretty much every time. She was so good, I used to just take her translation of the tests. I'd mark hers first and then use her translation as an answer key because I was never as good as her at it. It was just amazing. But most of us are more stilted and we do a kind of translator-ese. And what you really want is to translate as fundamentally as, you know, as idiomatic as possible while reflecting the regular Old English. Yeah, and David's put some links to some of the resources that I got there. Great, that's it. Any questions? Oh, sorry, I've got one more. In the end, your book will actually help you. Right now, Murray's book is keyed. Every word is actually in the form that it's found in the text, and it tells you what it is right beside it. So it'll say genitive, singular, masculine, nominative, accusative, nominative, singular, feminine, and all the information you need is right there. Later on, it gets a little bit harder. Okay, and then what I've done is, and I've said this several times, but I really recommend you write the Old English out by hand. This is an actual photograph of an actual book of my notes. And what you do is you write out the Old English by hand, leave lots of space, and then above or below, depending, I gloss above, most people gloss below. You write underneath each word what it is, nominative, singular, masculine, genitive, singular, feminine, third person, singular, past, and what that means in context. So if a word is like third person, singular, past, will, to want, you don't write third singular past to want, you write third singular past wanted. If something's in the genitive, you don't write stone, genitive, singular, masculine. You write genitive, singular, masculine of the stone. Same with the by, with, to, for. If it's in the dative, when you're glossing it, you write by, with, to, for, the stone. And the reason why you do that is that'll help you put it, your ear, help you put it in order as you work. And that ought to be it. Good luck. There we go. Once again, I'll stay for questions if anybody's got any, but otherwise show up in class maybe with the first page of the translation done. And with a bit of luck, we'll be able to pick that up in class. And again, I'll stay if anybody's got any questions.